Hi, this is Dick Halsey. This presentation is about St. Patrick's Cemetery that used to be on Pinnacle Hill. The hills of the Pinnacle Range were formed about 12,000 years ago by a retreating glacier. The peak of the Pinnacle is in the town of Brighton. The hill is mostly sand and gravel, which I'll come back to later. On the right is a postcard view of Pinnacle Hill from Cobb's Hill that's dated about 1907. In there you can see the earliest buildings of the Rochester Orphan Asylum, which is now Hillside Children's Center. But the cemetery was not on this part of the hill. It was on the southwest slope. St. Patrick's Church was the first Roman Catholic church formed in Rochester in 1822. Look how small their lot was. It's only about the same size as a city house lot. Histories of the church say that they had a small graveyard behind the church. In May 1827, the church petitioned to move the cemetery after just 5 years. This record of the request is from the early records of the village of Rochester. The request was approved. Those early burials were moved to West Cemetery, also called Buffalo Street Cemetery. It was on the south side of West Main Street, across from where Nick Tahu's is now. Then in 1837, when Mount Hope Cemetery was formed, the city offered St. Patrick's 5 acres in Mount Hope. They refused to offer as they wanted a Catholic cemetery. In 1838, the church bought approximately 21 acres on the southwestern slope of Pinnacle Hill. On the left side of the dotted line, the cemetery was in the city, but the largest portion of the cemetery was in the town of Brighton. There was supposedly a gate on Field Street, but no pictures of that gate have been found. There was also a vault built in the side of a cliff to store bodies in winter when they couldn't dig graves. This is a 1852 lot map for just the section of the cemetery that was in the city of Rochester. On this map, Field Street is indicated along the top. Also note the directional arrow in the bottom right corner. Most of these are family lots that are 20 by 10 feet. There were many more lots in the town of Brighton, including some single graves for the poor. Patrick O'Rourke was the most famous person buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery. He died in battle at Gettysburg, and was buried on the battlefield. He was dug up a couple of weeks later and had a big funeral at St. Bridget's Church here in Rochester. He was buried near the summit of Pinnacle Hill. Later, his widow became a nun, and she would climb the hill to visit his grave. But as she got older, she asked to have his grave moved to a lower place in the cemetery. Then he was dug up again in 1887 and buried in a family plot in Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. Hopefully, this fourth burial location will be his last. Notice that he was colonel of the 140th New York Infantry. Colonel Ryan took over the 140th New York Infantry after Colonel O'Rourke. He died at a battle near Spotsylvania, Pennsylvania. He was originally buried in Illinois. In 1870, he was dug up and had a funeral at St. Patrick's Church in Rochester and was buried next to Colonel O'Rourke at the top of Pinnacle Hill. When Colonel O'Rourke was moved to a lower location in the cemetery, so was Colonel Ryan. On the same day Colonel O'Rourke was interred in Holy Sepulchre, so was Colonel Ryan, right next to him. So he too has been buried in 4 different locations over the years. When Holy Sepulchre was opened in September 1871, some people started moving family graves from St. Patrick's Cemetery over to family lots in Holy Sepulchre. If you walk around the old part of Holy Sepulchre, that's on the east side of Lake Avenue, you'll find some of the graves that were moved. First, there is graves of Cornelius Collins and 4 children that were moved in November 1871. Mary Ann McGee died in September 1870, was buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery, but moved to Holy Sepulchre in November in 1871. 4 children of Patrick and Margaret Nolan that died in the 1860s and 70s were moved over to Holy Sepulchre, and they have this very nice, unique tombstone. Hugh O'Donnell, who died in 1849, and John O'Donnell, that died in 1852, also have a lot in the old part of Holy Sepulchre. Just the same, if a family owned a lot in St. Patrick's, then they could still be buried up on the Pinnacle Hill. This newspaper article from 1879 says that the cemetery on Pinnacle Hill was in bad condition. A group of over 100 people spent 2 days cleaning up the cemetery. The article also says there are pits around the cemetery from graves being removed to Holy Sepulchre. The Grand Army of the Republic was a Civil War veterans group. They noted that in St. Patrick's Cemetery, the grave of Captain McMullen was partially open and leg bones were visible. They set up areas in both Mount Hope and Holy Sepulchre for Civil War veterans to be buried. They spearheaded moving veterans from St. Patrick's to this nice lot in Holy Sepulchre. GAR lot is on the northeast corner of Section L. As noted, they moved groups of veterans' graves at least 3 separate times. In this newspaper article from 1907, it states there are still these Civil War veterans buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery that they want to move to Holy Sepulchre. The 4 in blue did end up getting moved in 1908. The one in red got moved in 1935 to an unmarked grave. I have not been able to figure out what happened to the ones in black. In 1887, St. Patrick's Church took Caspar Schwalberg to court to have him stop digging gravel so close to the cemetery. Mr. Schwalberg said he wasn't digging into the cemetery. This picture on the right was taken in 1895, but not published until 1929. Mr. Schwalberg owned land on both sides of South Clinton Avenue. In the second picture, I circled what could be a tombstone. I tried zooming in on the picture, but I'm still not sure if it's a tombstone or not. Part of the quarry would become Farview Hills Road. Later newspaper articles would say that the last burial in St. Patrick's Cemetery was on December 4th, 1900, but I haven't been able to figure out who that person is. In 1929, there was a flurry of newspaper articles about the cemetery. There was a push to have the city buy the cemetery and make Pinnacle Hill a park. St. Patrick's Church said that they would not object to the sale, but it didn't happen because the city didn't want to spend the money to move the burials and purchase the land. In 1935, they finally decided to move the remaining graves to Holy Sepulchre. Newspaper articles said that they would also move the tombstones, but actually no tombstones were moved. They did identify some people either by the tombstone or by brass plates on the coffins. In total, they removed 4,769 burials. All were placed in small burial boxes. They were about 2.5 feet long. They said that relatives could claim any of the removals, but I doubt any did. Ulysses McCarthy had died March 10, 1873, at age 80. He told his son John that he did not want to be buried in Holy Sepulchre. But by 1935, his son had died, and his granddaughter didn't know where he was buried. so he is one of the many unknown burials removed to Holy Sepulchre. On the left was what was left of the vault at St. Patrick's Cemetery. Stone on the right is the only memorial for all those burials that were moved to Holy Sepulchre in 1935. It's on a strip of land between sections M and K and sections 2 and 3 north. Holy Sepulchre online records do have some of the names of the people that were moved to common graves in 1935. Newspaper articles from the 1960s say they left either 4 or 6 burials on the former land of the cemetery, so it would always be considered a cemetery. I have no idea where those burials are located. In 1947 was the first talk about putting a TV tower on the top of Pinnacle Hill. This newspaper cartoon shows that opinion was against it. Again, people were saying that the hill should be a park. Now there are 4 TV towers on top of Pinnacle Hill, and they are much taller than the original one. The headline says it all. There were in 1959, and probably still are, some bones left somewheres on the hill. 1960, the whole former cemetery was purchased by Rochester Skytop, a corporation headed by Albert O. Fenivesi. His family used to own theaters in Rochester and a lot of real estate. He said he had no idea of what he would do with the land, but every 10 years or so, he would have an idea of either building a hotel or offices on the top of the hill. His last big push was in 1990. Instead, in 1995, Mr. Fenivesi donated all the land in the town of Brighton to Hillside Children's Center. He still retained ownership of the land in the city that is along Field Street, which is about 2.9 acres. Albert died in 2008 at age 99. Enter Carl Penn. He said he was a real estate developer from Dallas, Texas. It took a little while for more of the truth to come out. He was born Carol Fenivesi, and he was the nephew of Albert. He said that he wanted to put 12 luxury homes on the 2.9 acres of land in the city. Each of those lots would be a lot smaller than a standard city house lot. Put up a chain link fence around the property and also put up barbed wire. The city took him to court because barbed wire was against the law in the city. 1999, the city again took him to court as he was having some men cut down trees and one fell on power lines. He was supposed to provide an environmental impact statement before making any changes to the property. He had not done so. 2000, Brighton thinks about buying the property on the hill from Hillside, but it doesn't happen. Land in the city was transferred to Thomas Cassiana in 2000, then to Mark DeFelice in 2003. He put it into his corporation in 2007. Then in 2015 was the last transaction that I was able to find. In the early 90s, I heard that there might be some tombstones still on the old cemetery lot. On the base of the north side of the hill is the tombstone of Eleanor Greeno. That's a photo that I took in the 1990s. As you can see, it's been rolled down the hill. And the photo in the middle just has the initials JLD and no more. The photo on the right is a base for the Cullen family tombstone. In the 1990s, I did find a stone on the hill that just said Father. I hid it behind a tree. When I looked for it again a year later, it was gone. In late 2000, someone sent an email that there was a tombstone on the base of the south side of the pinnacle. The next spring, Scott Banker and I went to investigate. I took photos with two cameras, but Scott's photo turned out much better. This is the tombstone of Antoinette Huck. It's on private property to the northeast of the end of Farview Hills Road. There isn't any good way to visit this tombstone. I started collecting records of known burials in St. Patrick's Cemetery in the late 1980s, then created a web page in the 90s. It would eventually become so large that I had to split it into two web pages. The first book of Mount Hope Cemetery records contained burials in many cemeteries, including some in St. Patrick's Cemetery. Early Holy Sepulchre records indicate some removals from St. Patrick's Cemetery. There are a few death records included with St. Patrick's marriage records. From January to March of 2018, I visited the Rochester Diocese Archives. Sister Connie Derby let me transcribe all the records in the archives. She has two interment books from 1864 to 1888, removal book from 1935, but only for surnames A through K, and four books with removal slips. I supplemented all those records with some information from the Holy Sepulchre online records, and then also some random newspaper records. I'm still updating. I have about 3,500 names out of the approximately 5,000 original buried in the cemetery. I'm mostly missing burials from the 1850s and 60s. There are many videos on YouTube of mountain bikers on Pinnacle Hill. They have even made some jumps for their own use. Near the tombstones on the north side is this campfire, but notice that they have a barrel for their empty bottles. After I gave this presentation October 2023 to the Upper Monroe Neighborhood Association, a lady confirmed a rumor that I had heard many years ago. There's a house near the old cemetery that has a walkway made out of old tombstones. One reason for giving this presentation is the hope of finding photos of St. Patrick's Cemetery, like the front gate or some family plots. Thank you very much for watching this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something.